Hello, ELIC 30. This is Michael, and we are in How to Be Human, an Autistic Man's Guide to Life, continuing in Chapter 2. We are on page 42, near the bottom, where we see this new question expressed in italics. So, beginning there. On the issue of the inherent subjectivity found in language, Jory poses the following question. If you use language to think, do you really have your own thoughts? Okay, let's pause and just talk about this question for a little bit. There's some vocabulary here. Inherent as an adjective that means it's built in, it's always there. So I might say, for example, coldness is an inherent quality of ice. Ice is inherently cold. If it's not cold, it melts and it's no longer ice. So inherent means something that's a necessary part. Subjectivity, that noun, if something is subjective, that means that it's people have different opinions about it. It isn't exactly the same for everybody. And so the inherent subjectivity found in language, there's a lot built into here, but it basically means not everyone has the same vocabulary, and even a word in a language might have slightly different meanings to people who use it differently. And then the question, if you use language to think, do you really have your own thoughts? I just want to comment on this because this is so interesting in light of what we read in Miss Spitfire, where Annie is struggling with the idea that if Helen doesn't even have language, is she even capable of thought? Because to Annie, all of her thoughts were tied up in with language. And linguists have done a lot of study and philosophizing about that. In fact, there's a whole, a very influential linguistic theory called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which discusses this very issue. If people speak a different language, are they having the same thoughts? Are they able to conceptualize things the same way? So lots of stuff, very, very philosophical ideas built into this question. Let's see what Jory says. Jory, I look at that etching, okay, that etching, he keeps referring back to the etching, and that etching is the one that we saw back on page... what page was it in? It's in this chapter, a few pages back. Back on page 35. Okay, we saw this picture, which is an etching. An etching is a style of drawing where you actually carve the lines in rather than painting them on top. Let's go. I look at that etching and I wonder if people really have their own thoughts. Because if you use language to think, by definition, you are using something that has not been fully constructed by you. In my view, language always has some elements of subjectivity because it's limiting. For example, in some Inuit languages, there are many words to describe forms of snow and ice. I recently heard about the incredibly precise Gaelic phrase Rinach Maim, which means the shadows cast on moorland by clouds on a sunny day. All those specific words and phrases open more possibilities for sharing objective information. Whereas, in the places I've lived, Most people have only one way to refer to snow, unless you use a ridiculously long string of adjectives to precisely define the type of snow. But I think of that as a huge waste and also constraining. I think it limits objectivity. It's more difficult for me to translate and conjure a picture. Add worldviews and ideologies to that, and are you even thinking on your own? Or are you drawing from multiple pots of information and don't even realize it? Whereas with me, when I go into the storage cabinet, even if I can't find something I want, I don't pull out anything by mistake. Let's say I threw all the red Lego bricks up and then a yellow one appears for no reason. I would not treat that yellow brick as more important because it's yellow. But it seems to me that is what people are doing with words, ideologies, and culture. LW. What is objective information? What is subjective information? How do you define the difference? Jory. I think of information as being like an instrument reading, something you can see and directly experience through your senses. But anything that goes through another human mind, I consider to be subjective information. By that measure, another person's statement would be subjective information. Not that I don't trust that statement and information, but it's different. Other people seem to have a much broader definition of what makes information subjective or objective, and how you decide to classify something often depends on what you might have previously believed about that topic. Whereas for me, subjective and objective are very binary categories, depending on whether I've observed it myself or not. I never feel like I can ever make assumptions about another person because every time I've tried, it doesn't work very well. But I notice that sometimes other people automatically make assumptions without ever thinking about it. It's almost like they forget that they hold their ideologies. And I think that can create distrust. Whereas, from my perspective, it's not that I distrust people, but I don't assume things about them. Repeatedly, what stood out in our conversations was how much Jory perceives himself as a singular individual, not part of any particular group or community. It is a double-sided impression, one of both individuality and also isolation. Above all, Jory has a profound sense of being different from everyone else around him. It's a theme that we will return to in a variety of forms. LW. We've talked about how your brain is organized and some about how it approaches information. Let's talk about how it puts together that information. How do you think? Jory. Nobody can really understand how I think. Their basis of comparison is themselves and other people who think neurotypically. But this also means that in many situations, I can potentially bring something entirely different to the table. I can even say the equivalent of, why are we focused on a table? Why aren't we talking about a carnival? Everybody else will be like, what? But that is the way I see things. I see things from an entirely different vantage point and on an entirely different plane. I'd be the first to say that I'm very limited in what I can do that other people are good at, but the same is true in reverse. The small number of us out there who think differently, whether it's from autism or some other reason, might have something valuable to bring to the discussion. We can have a real benefit. There are going to be positives and negatives. I try to take advantage of what I can. I also try to recognize the gaps, like the common sense holes, which I will never be able to fill in. And then I try to use the benefits. LW. What are those common sense holes that confound you? What are the everyday tasks that you find hard? Jory. That's a good question. As far as things that I sort of struggle with, one of them is definitely when I'm told something and it's extremely short term and extremely simple, and all I have to do is remember it. I have trouble with that. For instance, Mom might give me a list of 4 or 5 things, and each one is an incredibly simple thing, like pick up almond milk at the store or do the dishes. These tasks are not challenging. You think if you're given a list, especially a small list, it would be easy to remember. But actually, it's really hard for me to remember, and I think the reason why is there's nothing for my brain to connect it to. There are no other pegs I can use to connect it to other parts of my brain, the way I can with facts or ideas and objects. I'll remember to do 2 out of the 3 things. My brain will think, oh, I did all the things that Mom wanted me to. I will do all the things that Mom wanted me to do. But in fact, I didn't, because one of them just fizzled out, for lack of a better term. And that is pretty frequent. I'll go to the corner store and get something Mom had requested a few days prior, but not the almond milk she requested that morning. I also have a hard time with things involving tools. I'll be doing something and there will be a much easier way to do it, maybe by using a different tool or the same tool but in a different manner, and I just don't see it. It's like once my brain sort of sees a solution to the problem, even if it's a difficult solution, I'll keep doing it, where most other people would think, oh, that's not working. Let me try something easier. I'll be like, well, this is only going to take me 20 seconds, so I'm just going to do it. But Mom will be able to do it in 5 seconds. I'll wonder, why didn't I think of that? Most people think of my solutions to the problem. Most people think of many solutions to the problem and pick the best ones. My brain's more like the first come, first served approach, especially with tools. Sometimes the sequence in which I do tasks doesn't make sense either. For example, if I'm taking out the trash, it might make sense to first take the trash inside the house out to the trash bin, and then take the full bin to the street. But I might flip those tasks. I'll take the bin out, and then I'll walk back inside and back out again with the additional trash, adding an extra trip. I don't think about logical sequencing in simple tasks. I just sort of do the simple tasks in any order. LW. What about simple tasks versus more complex tasks? Which are more difficult for you? Jory. Generally speaking, most people seem to find simple tasks not particularly draining, but they find higher level tasks or thinking to require more energy. I'm the reverse. I find simple tasks really draining, while thinking tasks are not really draining for me. A good example was when I transcribed interviews that I did for my master's thesis at Oxford. It's just listening and typing, but I feel like it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. It wasn't hard. The recordings are extremely clear, but because it was just typing, it was really difficult for me. The people I interviewed had to look at a bunch of maps and answer questions about what they had seen, about numbers and colors and various features on the maps. It took about an hour and 15 minutes to complete the interview and study the maps. When I asked them about the experience, many times they said it was surprisingly tiring because they had to look at maps and think about things. I noticed enough of these comments to realize that people find it draining to think about many statistical graphics problems for over an hour, whereas if you were to give me that test, at the end I would say, "Oh, we're done? Where's more?" Because I wouldn't have found that task draining at all. I think most people, when they think about autistic people having difficulty with simple tasks, they assume it's because of incompetence. It's almost difficult for them to imagine that a simple task may, in fact, be draining for me in much the same way that they find complicated tasks draining. It's not my personal preference for this to be the case. It certainly would be more convenient if simple tasks were simpler, but alas, it's not to be. And we'll stop there, and the next video will take up at the bottom of page 47.